everyone, I'm Sam, an airport ecologist at Mastermark. It's an honor to have with us today in Singapore, Nick Yearwood. With over 36 years of experience at the UK Civil Aviation Authority and now consulting independently with International Bird Strike, Nick is a prominent figure in aviation regulation, policy, and bird strike management. Notably, he contributed to ICAO's DOC 9137 Airport Services Manual Part 3. Nick, thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you, Sam. It's my pleasure to be here in lovely, warm Singapore. It's going to be a great experience for me to share my insights and experiences with you all and the team.
Nick, my first question, are you enjoying the Singapore heat?
Absolutely, Sam. It's so wonderful to be in 13 degrees at the middle of British winter.
That's why I moved here. Nick, I know Singapore isn't the first place you've traveled. I know you've been all over the world. Are there any case studies from all of your travels where public opinion has significantly influenced wildlife management decisions at airports?
Yes, Sam, actually, there is one particular case that springs to mind many years ago where I was informed of a significant bird strike event that happened. And the pictures were quite emotive because it was a bird that is seen as sacrosanct for the public and has connotations and connections with royal family. And so the airport were left with the dilemma of not understanding or knowing what they could do about that bird, which was frequent in the airfield, had flight loads crossing the airfield. And we then had to call a meeting with the airport operatives and the swan marker on behalf of Her Majesty.
Sorry, so this bird was a swan.
Yes. Look on, more than one swan, many swans, in fact, that were flying up the River Thames, crossing the runway at the eastern end of London. And from the public's perspective, they are untouchable. You can't touch or control them.
They're a very pretty bird, so I get it.
And they're graceful, and they're seen as, we want to live around areas of water where there are nice swans and ducks and geese. And so it became really difficult for the airport to understand what they do. And so, from one hand, we as the regulator then were only primarily concerned with aviation safety, flight safety, public safety, whereas the airport had their responsibility to control or enhance safety of the operation of aircraft. At the same time, you have wildlife in the vicinity, which is uncontrollable.
So swans are a very large bird. I think in the UK, they might be one of the largest birds, right? So you have one of the largest bird species, but also one of the most beloved. What do you do?
It's very difficult. It took a couple of days after the bird strike event for us to come up with a joint plan together to support the airport. And the only way to move forward was to try and remove, as far as possible, as many swans from the vicinity of the airfield, which was never going to be an easy task.
So how do you remove large swans from a populated urban metropolis that is Greater London?
Well, the program that we had mission to support from the airport's perspective was to go out onto the river and the docks around the airfield at night on a weekend, and to use canoes and netting and capture the swans in a humane way without causing distress or without causing injury, and then to relocate those swans to a safer area. So on a given evening in the summertime of that year in question, a team of people that descended on the water around the airport, with the help of the local security people and the police, and notifying the relevant agencies, including Her Majesty's Swan Marker, who had given authorization for the swans that were ostensibly owned by the Queen to be moved.
Sorry, Swan Marker. What is that job title? I've never heard of that.
It's a gentleman who resides at Cambridge University.
Okay.
That's an official title. He's the kind of coordinator of all of the swans in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
Which are considered to be owned by the Queen, or now is the King. And he's concerned with conservation and safety of swans wherever they may be. And he really didn't understand anything about bird strike risk, wildlife management from an aviation respect. And so for the airport to be allowed to do anything at all with the swans, had to have his approval. And he would have had to brief the Queen to say this is what would be happening. And he told us that he didn't accept the argument of flight safety. He had no prior knowledge of bird strike, what it meant, and the fact that such large birds could actually cause significant issue for flight safety. So once we managed to convince him, we supported the airport with their position. They had to manage the environment by reducing as far as possible. He accepted the proposal, albeit, he didn't really want it to happen then, but we knew that we had something have to happen. He wasn't there at the time to capture the birds, but he given an approval. And the birds were then captured, and they made a lot of noise, and the residents of the apartments around the water in East London called the police, called their local councillors, called the media. And so it became like a big, almost a party of people all descending on the river and the locks around the airport.
And the British media isn't known to be most.
And if you Google now, you can see, so I think it's 2011, there's lots of people talking about, conservation versus flight safety. And the airports are always seen as public enemy number one for removing animals and birds that live happily in coexistence. But such large birds cannot be in coexistence uncontrolled near airports.
Now, I know swans are not known to be the quietest birds. So that night, was it easy to get them out, or did they happen to, make some honking noises on their way out?
It was very difficult. There was a lot of noise, which woke up all the residents, which made it even worse because up until that point, the airport hadn't pre-briefed the residents around the airport and around the Dockland area.
And it's like high-rise buildings, casually?
Yeah,
Where a lot of people dense, right?
Yeah, very dense, very much like Singapore, that kind of area.
Yeah.
And people have bought these apartments or rented apartments with literature on the front page, which showed this lovely water, this serene countryside, waterside area with geese and ducks and swans. And so the children were all out there every day feeding the birds with bread and seeds.
That's why you moved there.
Yeah. And so they had no understanding that, within 3 kilometers away of a runway could be seen the safety significant for aviation. So the task was to collect the birds as humanely as possible. And they only actually managed to had to kill one bird, which was injured anyway. And they captured, I think, 14 birds altogether and put with tobacco band. But the noise was incredible, and the disruption and the disturbance was, really loud for all the residents that surrounded the water. And so from the media were there, live TV were there, and it was deemed to be a bad PR exercise for the airport. So they had their own PR people there to talk about ADA safety or what they were doing. They weren't there to kill the birds, but this was to move to a safer area, safer for public to be flying, safer for economic operations.
So with 15 of those swans gone, did the airport see less damaging strikes?
Touch wood, as we say, since that occasion, and also due to greater diligence from the airport, we haven't seen any further bird strikes by swans.
Knock on wood.
But there have been, and so the population has reintroduced itself back to those areas purely because it's a safer environment, there's more availability of food. Again, they've now put up, to stop public feeding the birds, they put signage up all around the apartments and the kind of public always, like, jogging routes, cycling routes, not to feed the swans, not to feed geese. But that can't be enforced by anybody particularly. But they've been lucky due to greater diligence from the airport operatives to surveying the 13-kilometer area to know how many geese there are and where possible to disperse them.
Geese or swans?
Geese and swans.
Oh, they're both.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So besides the PR nightmare, it seemed like operators and regulators work pretty well together to make things happen.
Yeah, we did do on this occasion, and we always strive to work in harmony to support airports. We have no real control over the activity they manage, so we felt we had to support them regardless of what they needed to do, whether that meant lethal action or some type of population control or just moving birds. We've always been an advocate of supporting working in harmony with their stakeholders, i.e. the airports.
We as in the UK Civil Aviation Authority, or is that the whole world basically?
It's in my experience, it's only really happening in Northern America and perhaps Northwestern Europe or Western Europe. And some of the places where I've visited where you have similar scenarios with hazardous wildlife on and in the vicinity of airports, the CAA is at an arm's length from the regulator and is pointing the finger, do something, but they're not really helping them or working in partnership with them, and then use the regulatory activity as a punitive action against the airport. And there's always obviously a degree of distance between the regulator and the airport operators. Often was the case, I discovered, that they don't know each other. It's always often an office-based type meeting, the regulator as with the airport operator, not getting to know the people and directly managing safety.
Right. Is there any, I know you've been all around, is there any examples of that you've seen around the world?
Some of the places I've been to in Central Eurasia and also Southeast Asia, there's been a very interesting dynamic between the CAA and the airport operators, such that there's a fear factor between the two in terms of the airport operator is fearful of the regulator. They don't want to be seen to be doing something non-compliant or not in accordance with what they've been told to do. So the regulator is very prescriptive. You must do this, you will do that. But without ever really visiting those sites, the airport, talk to people about the effectiveness of the regulations or guidance to, and also not talking to them is sharing information, not consulting, not really engaging on a one-to-one basis. So there's a real distance between the two parties, but we're all working in harmony to deal with aviation safety, or supposedly, yet the regulator is very engaging to understand the constraints of the local rules and guidance. And often in this case, they wanted more than with the airport, the regulator is able to provide.
So if there's a gap between the regulators here and we have the operators here, how do we bridge that gap?
It can only be by changing mindset, really, that we're all working together in aviation safety, and not to have a highlight structure and it invites your stakeholders, i.e. the air operators, into the offices to visit the airports, go out with the guys who do the job, not just sit in the office with a senior manager, but talk to the guys who do the technical job. Now, and just ask them the key questions about the effectiveness of what they see, the regulations or the guidance material that they're supposed to be working within the cool fight.
Even certain dispersal methods. They could get them out to do a stop whip here or there, right?
Yeah, I used to. And it's also very difficult when the CAs have expectations that airports should manage wildlife, but without the states being able to provide them with an opportunity to use certain types of weaponry or pyrotechnics, which is a huge constraint to the activity. Whereas in certain parts of the world, they can use weaponry and all sorts of other pyros, which can be far more effective. And maybe you can disperse predator far easier and control the activity to some extent, or manage the activities of wildlife far easier using old conventional methods such as warp-sea, etc.
Okay, so do you have any actual examples of this gap that needs to be bridged?
Yeah, one springs to mind, one particular episode of wildlife hazards in far flooded places, where I was out with the bird control team with the local state regulator, who was the aerodrome inspector, and we drove around the airfield with the wildlife operative. And we got to a location just off of the airfield where there was a drop in the ground and bushes, trees, and what have you. And I got out the vehicle and look around and asked what was down there and why it had been netted off. Was of the bushes and weeds and all sorts of things. And as I looked down to this kind of low-lying area, almost to reveal a 10 to 3 meter drop, I could see at least 6 to 8 dead birds with blood freshly killed. And I just asked the bird controller, what's happened here? And they started to laugh and kind of cover their faces. And the regulator was shocked and was looking at me, and I looked at him, said, what's this? And so they got their phones out and said that before I'd arrived to do this audit, this oversight, that they would normally have a washing light. In the mornings, they overnight or mornings, they'd trap birds, break their wing or cut their throats or some kind of damage, kill the birds, and then hang them on this washing line as it's a terrible buzz. And the regulator had never seen that. And so when I asked him, what do you think about this? He was very shocked and embarrassed and had no prior knowledge about activity. And so we talked about the effectiveness of that activity, given that we knew that there were loads of bird strikes happen to the state carrier that was flying in and out, in addition to low-cost carriers with very new Airbus aircraft. When you had a scenario like that, notwithstanding it wasn't really about compliance, but to see that kind of activity, which was from an untrained eye perspective, he didn't understand why they were doing that, why they weren't following ICAO's documentation or even their local state guidance, which was very much based on ICAO. And so he was almost embarrassed to accept that this kind of activity goes on, and that's what the airport chose to do, but had no understanding why they didn't. There was no evidence it was effective, given that there were so many bird strikes and so many birds on and around the airfield whilst we were there. And so he decided the next day to try to close the airport out of embarrassment rather than any safety assessment about what has happened.
Right. But in the UK, they have.
Not really. Well, they don't need to because we have Cat 772. Okay, so we couldn't distill 9137 into our 90s dirt. And because of the legacy of the UK and ICAO over many, many years, when they did my 137 was only based on the UK document, a whole lot of speaking, because ICAO in those days was dominated by Brits. Right. Okay, in the rulemaking.
So I can say, okay, so I assume these operators in this Central Asian country have never really had any say or haven't seen a lot of the guidance material.
Yeah, sad. These guys have never seen any ICAO documentation. And although ICAO do translate it into five languages, that doesn't get rolled out beyond state authority. And because of the relationship between the state authority and the local operators, there's a huge gap of an information void. So 9137 will be rolled out and published and taken on board by the local CAA, but they don't been out that knowledge via local guidance or local rules necessary to the local operatives or the local operators. So there's a huge void and gap in understanding and expectation. So you see that in really poor, ineffective wildlife hazard management, working on their own without really any help from, say, CAA.
So you kind of want to fill the gaps between even your local guidance material all the way up to a bigger document like 9037.
Yeah, and this is the whole purpose of the work we envisioned to do with 9137 was to make that document available to all people beyond the CAs. Otherwise, we were not writing that doc with the CAs because the CAs don't manage bird control or wildlife hazard. That has to be imparted to the operators. So how states do that is very different. Whether that means they change the local guidance and local rules based on 9137, or many states will just work straight to 9137. So there's a mismatch in when you go to different countries. Some use local guidance based on or foundation of 9137, while some countries have no local guidance and work straight to 9137. And so 9137 is a universal document. It doesn't fit every scenario, every case, every size and complexity of airports. So it doesn't really help airports who are starting from ground zero to understand they perhaps need more. They need their hands held a lot more with basic, simple guides to get the fundamentals right. And perhaps 9137 doesn't really do that. 9137 has the expectation that states and airports are already doing something that's pretty good. And all we've done is enhance that and embellish it, make it stronger and firmer, without really appreciating that many countries aren't did it or can't deal with the very basics to any great extent. Right.
So you are a policy guy, right? Let's say put your brain as a brand new airport operator. How would you approach this then? Kind of being involved with some of the understanding documents and policy. If you put yourself in their shoes, maybe let's say.
My advice in that scenario, or my thought process, would be immediately to engage with local SLEs, well, local or international people that got great experience and wide experience of wildlife hazard, bird control, data, policy making, or dissecting policy making to understand what fits. Because there has to be a degree of interoperability and interpretation of all the libraries for what works best for your site. So you need to know what the constraints are. What are you working with? And come up with a local set of guidance or local policy with which you can then develop your local wildlife hazard management plan. The plan hasn't got to be comprehensive. That could be embellished and expanded over time. But initially, you want an assessment by people who know and understand your and SMEs, such as Mastermind.
Yeah, I always found WHMPs to be very concrete. Like it's one document and it's out, but WHMP should be more of a conversation. Is that kind of what you're hinting at? It should be year on year, built upon, kind of like a tree growing thicker and thicker every year. It's as you start your WHMP and you go 5 years, it should be a little more comprehensive and even more comprehensive. And by the end of the decade, it's hugely successful. Have you found that to be the case?
It's often the case that the WHP is really only produced to satisfy a regulator.
Oh,
So it's a regulation. Do you have WHMP? It's not the question of how does the document evolve, which we would consider to be paramount for the operator to be doing. Otherwise, it's a static document just setting out a very broad, basic set of parameters with which and how they manage wildlife hazard. And so we would always encourage there has to be a review process, a review cycle of any document, as part of an SMS and QMS. But in terms of wildlife hazard management plans, it should really be descriptive on what you do, why you do it, and what changes have been made and on the basis of what observations of wildlife, changes in the wildlife, not to bird strikes, the type of equipment you guys are using. And so it has to be holistically reviewed periodically. But it shouldn't be produced purely for the sake of or satisfied regulator, which are his.
Yeah, so right now it's almost like a book report. They did it. We've got it right here, but it should be more of a conversation.
Yes,
Now, as a ecologist, I do like my nature. I like my trees. I like my birds. Is there any maybe case study of a regulator or an airport regulator, let's say, that took it too far? Maybe took it for face value, like something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the example this brings to mind is where on our second visit to an airport in Africa, we monitored the vicinity and discovered on the first visit there were some birds in the trees, under the trees at certain times of the day. And this was in
Sorry, the biologist nerd. What kind of birds?
these were hooded vultures. I'm big.
Yeah.
But also there were black kites circling around in the thermals in the runway. But this tree in particular was on the flight line, on the center line, the extended center line, 2 kilometers beyond the thresholds, maybe more than 2. And on our second visit, we went out and did a tour of the outside, looking outside the fence beyond into the horizon. And we noticed the tree had disappeared in the schoolyard. So we asked the guys and the CAA what happened to the tree. And they kind of said, well, it was full of birds. And you picked up the fact that there were the birds on the ground. And we actually visited the site in the schoolyard, in the playfield or in the playing yard for the children. And it must have been at least 100 years old. It was a huge tree. They decided to go in and say it has to be chopped out. Well, we never suggested that. We just said to manage the environment, survey the vicinity, come up with a plan, and execute the plan. They thought that meant chop everything. So when we were driving around the other side of the airfield, we could see lots of logs of many trees, but there was one typical tree, but they must have cut down at least 10 trees in the vicinity outside the downward effects. But that had stopped birds being on and in the vicinity of the aerodrome. So that's a really sad case to see. But you can see there how wildlife has it to different people wins different things in terms of how to fix it or what to do, and not understanding what's taught to you or what other mechanisms and mitigations could be employed.
So just because Nick Yearwood's coming to your airport doesn't mean you have to knock down the whole forest. At least I think even the hooded vulture, I believe, is a critically endangered species too. So yeah, I could see how that could be a sad story. And you're like, no, he took it too literal. Maybe just tree pruning or something like that, not a full cut that. Yeah. So we talked about the UK. We talked about Asia, just Africa now. Is there any common denominator between all of the places that you've traveled, between them and wildlife hazard management?
Absolutely. And the key for me has always been about the people that I've met who are doing the job at a tactical and operational level. And they've really wanted to learn more from us, ask questions where they could, to understand what and how they could learn more and what more they wanted to do. They're all very enthusiastic about the job, but were constrained by perhaps the relationship between themselves as an operator level and the CAA, and the CAA at state level not providing enough for them. And so they wanted to learn more. Could you send me this? Could you show me this? And it was a great enthusiasm, all of them, to do and want to do a better job, which so encouraging to see, regardless of where they were, their educational level or language level or the basic equipment they had. They all wanted to do or tried to do more and wanted to ask and understand how they were getting on. Am I okay? Do you show me what to do? And so we gave workshops, we did training, we did one-to-one mentoring. which helped them. I also appreciate
for Pat. So between all of them, everyone has a willingness to learn or grow a better WHMP, which is nice, right? Yeah, that is good. All right, my last question for you would be, what advice would you have for anyone who is looking to significantly impact their WHMP, regardless of where they're from?
Without doubt, my opinion is that people should challenge the status quo. That means, yes, you understand the guidance locally, the regulation locally, perhaps the international global guidance, I-137, and from ICAO and elsewhere, but actually challenge that, because everything that we produce is open to interpretation. It's about how you apply it as a basic minimum. It doesn't mean to say that's how you should only do it and can only do it. And so challenge that status quo. Develop your own understanding, your own ideas. Use different ways, be it mechanisms that will suit you as an operator, as a technician, as a bird controller on this one shift.
That is good advice. Without getting terminated. Kind of, that is good.
When we look at the DOC 9137 review group at ICAO, the expert group on wildlife asset management, there's a huge generational shift between that age group and what I see locally with the master market, the guys that are working on the airfield to manage bird strikes. And so it's really important that I'm sure that you guys have a different view on things that can work on and processes and language. And I've really tried to emphasize this week in talking to you guys in the type of language you use. Type of language we use is very different to the type of language Gen Z and others have used.
Sure, sure. I'm a zillennial, so I'm a millennial Gen Z, but so I'm not too young, but I do agree. Like when we talk about bird strikes, I know my generation, or sometimes even just newer people in the field, we actually like reporting bird strikes because it's more data we can work with. Instead of trying to push the bird strikes under the rug, we want that data so that we can actually work to mitigate those bird strikes instead of pretending no bird strikes here. So I do get what you mean there.
So what I would end with, Sam, from my perspective, is here's the pattern for you guys, the next generation, to run with, because it's really now over to you.
I guess it's up to my generation to take the baton. No sweat. All right, all right. We will make sure to change the status quo. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. I know the viewers at home and us at Mastermark appreciate you being here.
Hope you said to be my absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. And to help you guys and learn more from you, as well as answer my knowledge and experience.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think it's time for lunch. Let's do it.